I've heard that with war, every battle plan changes on first contact with the enemy or something like that. So there needs to be scenario plannings for the what ifs. But does God do scenario planning? Does God have backup plans and backup plans for the backups? I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. We've been getting to know my friend Moses, his early life, inner child, initial failures, flight to Midian, beginning a family, his hybrid cultural and spiritual background, and an event at a burning bush. The section of Exodus that I've been looking at is really an extended conversation between Moses and God, in which God initiates the whole thing. God made the first move, appeared in the fire, and then began the dialogue by uttering the first words. I'm returning to that conversation in this episode. As a dialogue, it goes back and forth through several exchanges, with God taking the first round and then Moses moving it forward with questions and responses such as, who am I? Like, why me? Who are you? Who's talking here? What if the people don't believe me? Actually, I'm not comfortable speaking. I don't have what it takes. I'm not qualified. And then, why don't you just send somebody else? This dialogue is actually one of the reasons that I feel such an affinity with Moses as a friend. And so I want to dig into it more fully now. And so far, we've gotten to the point at which this divine voice from the flaming bush tells Moses that he's been chosen to bring Israel out of their enslavement in Egypt. And that's when he asks his first question. So we get to Moses' question in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. It tells us, Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And then God responds to that, saying, certainly, I'll be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it's me, I, who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this mountain. Moses' question, who am I, comes from a sense of his own inadequacy, I'm sure. After all, what credentials could he or anyone else possibly see in himself? It's been 40 years since he was in Egypt. He's a total outsider now, likely to be received with suspicion even by his own people. They might say things like, you're the one who ran away and we had to face all this here on our own. And now you have come to rescue us? Where have you been? Who do you think you are? And let's face it, his earlier attempts at helping his people had not gone well, and actually were the reason that he had to run away. Which leads to another fear, perhaps. The last time I was there, Pharaoh wanted to kill me. I've no idea what sort of reception I will get from the Egyptians, although I can guess. Now later, God is going to assure him that the people who wanted to kill him are dead, but he doesn't know that at this point. In addition, there might be a normal and even very human fear at work here, fear of not being enough, not good enough, not prepared enough, just not enough. Looking back on things from outside the world of the text, you and I might be able to say to Moses, look, you're from Israel. You know them. You grew up in the household of Pharaoh, and you know how things work there. So you know how to navigate both of those worlds, at least to some extent. And you've traveled through the wilderness from Egypt to very near the land to which you're being told that you're supposed to lead the people of Israel. And you know where the mountain is that God says you're going to worship at. You know the way. You know what it is like to survive out here. So you ask, why you? Well, I'm asking who else? Who else would be better at this job than you, Moses? But it's interesting to me that that is not the way that God tries to reassure Moses or answers his question. God answers Moses in two ways. One is very direct, and the other is a slightly different kind of response. The direct answer comes in verse 12. God said, "Certainly I will be with you. I'll be with you." God doesn't say anything similar to what I just said above about why Moses is the perfect person for this. Really, the only person qualified, if you ask me. God's response has nothing to do with Moses' qualifications at all. God doesn't reassure Moses by telling him, "You are perfectly adequate," which is what you and I would probably be tempted to do. Instead, God simply says, "I'll be with you. You're not alone. There's something bigger than you in all this." And I find that to actually be far more encouraging than the sort of simplistic positive thinking affirmation mantras that are so frequently prescribed as cures for self doubt in our day and age. I also find it more encouraging than somebody sort of pumping me up with all the reasons why I might be qualified. That actually does not quell my self doubt. Now, self affirmations and affirmation have their place. And yeah, do that. Like, do self affirmations with yourself. And I'm speaking to myself here as well. But the assurance that the text tells us Moses received is of a different sort. Be assured you're not alone. And let me just give a little bit of personal reflection on why that's so meaningful to me to imagine that that could be possible. I've held positions of executive leadership in two nonprofit organizations. I'm also a small time do it yourself artist who performs and releases music and poetry. And I'm a small time do it yourself podcaster. And in all of those versions of myself, I have a keen sense of my own inadequacies and an abiding hunger for reassurance. And I tend quite naturally to want to take that from some kind of specific encouragements. Things like being told that my leadership was inspiring or effective, that my songs and poems have left an impact, and hearing about what that is, or that my podcasts are meaningful and appreciated, that I have what it takes. But Moses really helps me see that I actually want something else. I want the reassurance that he's being offered, actually. And let me explain that a little bit. I actually believe that the divine, source with a big S, is personal. Now, I agree that personal is not an adequate word. Buddha has really helped me understand that in particular. I understand, too, that God's not just a person or personal in the way we might assume, and not a self in the way we think of that normally. And again, thank you to the Buddha. But if God is more than personal and other than or in addition to personal, God has various qualities, that doesn't mean that God is less than personal. Not a mere principle, not a force or fate or just providence, at least in the way that I see it. I believe that God is personal and more than personal, and personal in ways that are different than I might normally use that word, but still personal. So, what I find that I hunger for, and Moses seems to have received, is the reassurance that I'm not alone, that someone, big S, was leading in and through me in those years of my executive leadership roles and is working in and through me, creating in and with me now. More than that, more than quote unquote doing things in and through me, I just want that reassurance that the divine being is being in and with me in my being, and vice versa, that I am being in the divine being. Now, I made a point to emphasize the divine and human co-agency in the specific case of Moses in the last episode. We spent a lot of time on that. The texts say that God will bring the Israelites out of Egypt, but the text also says that Moses will do it, both and, God with Moses, Moses with God. However, I think the text has gone into all the details of Moses' childhood and background in addition to this in order to make another point, that God didn't just start to be with Moses now when he wants to do something. This withness, this co-agency, this divine in the human agency thing seems to me necessarily to have also been true during Moses' childhood and trauma, and mine and yours, and in his family fractures, and mine and yours, and during the long years in Midian as a person of no importance, similar to seasons of life that you and I might have, and in all the hybrid mixes of who Moses is, as well as mine and yours. All of that, I think, gets wrapped into the co-agency of the divine and human. I don't mean that the divine is doing the things that create trauma. What I mean is that the co-agency that the divine might have with you or I is already brewing in those experiences. The person we're becoming, with whom divine co-agency may take place, that's already happening early on in our life. Now, looking ahead a bit, I think that what I'm referring to here as divine and human co-agency is something that Jesus and the Buddha are going to talk about with Moses when I bring them together in the future to have a conversation. It touches on themes such as like what the Gospel of John describes as the divine word becoming human, and the way that the Buddha describes the way the self is not an isolated, independent thing, but that what we call the self is profoundly, inextricably interconnected with everything. I think all of that has connections for this divine co-agency thing we see in the book of Exodus. But let me get back to Moses. Moses receives direct reassurance. I am with you. And there is a different sort of assurance offered as well, as I suggested. And it also is seen as we continue with verse 12. This will be the sign to you that it's I who have sent you. When you've brought the people of Israel out of Egypt, you're going to worship God here at this mountain. In other words, God tells Moses, go do this, and then reassures him by saying, oh, and by the way, here's the proof. What you're going to do is going to happen. In effect, it's like saying, it's okay that you feel inadequate, but here's the proof that you're the right person. The sign is that what I'm telling you to do is what you will do, and it will happen when you do it. You will lead the people out, and you will bring them here to where you and I are talking right now. You'll see. It's going to happen. Now, notice this proof, this reassurance is only going to be real, quote unquote, after the fact. Moses is only going to taste and test this by doing it. There's a lot of talk these days about manifesting future things, like when we hear people say, I manifested this or that a year ago, and now here it is. But in this event, notice it's not Moses that's manifesting anything on his own behalf or the behalf of people of Israel. In fact, he's not even sure he believes it at this point, as far as I can tell. If there's any manifesting going on, it's the divine being, God, that is doing the manifesting. And I can't help but point out, by the way, that in response to Moses' first question, who am I to do this? Although God does offer reassurance, God never actually answers Moses' specific question. God's answer says nothing about who Moses is. God said more about who God is. I will be with you. God's nature includes withness, it seems, according to the books of Moses. Well, let's get to the next question, which is where Moses says, okay, if this is who I am, which, as I just said, God never answered, who are you that's talking to me? I think this may be what prompts this whole question of God saying, I'm going to be with you, is what really prompts this next question, actually. All right, if you're going to be with me, who are you? So verse 13 is where we pick up. Moses said to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I'm going to say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they're going to say to me, well, what's his name? Do you know who he is? And what am I going to tell them? Moses says. God said to Moses, I am who I am. He went on to say, that's what you will say to the sons of Israel. I am has sent me to you. Furthermore, God said to Moses, you will say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. my memorial name to all generations. Now, there's two main angles in the conversation here. First, what is Moses actually asking? And then what's the question behind the question? So that's the first one. What's Moses asking and what's the question behind it? And then secondly, there's the answer that is given. So let's talk first about what is the question. Moses isn't really asking what I would call an ontological question here. He's not asking what sort of being God is, nor is he asking about God's character, like, what are you like? His question is actually really practical, and it's rooted, as was his first question, in his insecurity and in his worries that this won't work. Remember, although he was born to Israelite parents and was for a few early years raised by them, and this would have had some degree, he would have then had some degree of awareness of the Israelite sacred heritage and of Israel's God, he would have been much more shaped by and familiar with two other religious worlds where he spent a lot more time: the Egyptian religious world and the Midianite religious world. And it's from the latter, perhaps from his travels in the broader world of the ancient Near East, that he would have been familiar with the word El, E-L, as a word for God, either used by itself or else used in one or more of the many combinations in which it was used in that area, including, as we've talked about in previous episodes, Elohim. But what he asks here is a question that has behind it the whole backdrop of the ancient Near East and the tendency of different peoples to have a particular national or local deity, or at least a particular national local way of talking to and about the divine. That doesn't mean that all peoples of the time assumed that the various local and national deities were somehow limited only to their own people, although that was a common belief. There seems to be examples of incipient early monotheistic ideas that there is one supreme God. Nonetheless, it was important to know the particular name and identity of one's national deity. And that seems to be what Moses is asking. Quote unquote, look, if I go back after being away for 40 years, and let's face it, I barely know my people and their traditions, I don't even know what they call you. I mean, somebody's going to say, okay then, Moses, who talked with you? What am I going to tell them? And that brings us then to the second dimension of this part of the conversation, which is the answer. With Moses' first question, God didn't really give a direct answer, not exactly. Moses asks, who am I? God says, I'll be with you. This time, God does answer, but also adds information that Moses wasn't really asking for. So Elohim is a way of speaking of a divinity widely known in the ancient Near East. And so that's the name being used for God in this conversation. And that Elohim says here, well, I'm Yahweh, and I'm the Elohim of your ancestors, Moses. Now, the people of Israel had known God, Elohim, as Yahweh for generations, actually. In fact, according to the books of Moses, some of the earliest human beings called God by that name, going back to the period when Adam and Eve were alive. And we're told, for example, way back in Genesis 4, that human beings began to call on the name Yahweh. That's a long time ago in reference to the time frame that we're at here in Exodus. Now, it's going to get a little confusing later, because later in Exodus, we're going to be told that God tells Moses, nobody called me by this name before. We'll come to that when we get there. But at this point, what Moses is hearing is the name Yahweh that the people of Israel had been using since before there was a people of Israel. So it's nothing new in one sense. But it does seem that somehow something new is revealed here. Not the name per se, not just the word that's being used, for that was already known to Israel, although it does seem to be new to Moses. What's new here is really the meaning given for that name. God said to Moses, I am who I am, and said, you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Now, I went into this in a prior episode, but let me add a bit here. The root word in Yahweh is haya, a foundational verb to be, like is in English, was or will be, being, etc. It's the root in the first let there be statements in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, creation, let there be light, for example. God didn't, like the things in creation did, come to be, but God is simply is and will be. But there's more to it here. Who is the God who is? Well, God is what God is the answer. And I think this connects to the co-agency we've been talking about, the withness of God. For God's isness, I am who I am, isn't actually distant and abstract and theoretical, as is the case in later Greek ways of thinking about God's being. The isness of God, the beingness of God, is experienced as withness. Moses has been told that this God will be with him, and when Moses asks who this God is who's speaking and promising their presence, he gets the enigmatic, mysterious answer, I am who I am. And I am who I am is amming with you. God doesn't seek to clarify or explain or define himself. There's something ineffable, impenetrable, something more than the mind or imagination can fathom. Let me do a little bit more about this whole Yahweh Elohim relationship, Yahweh God, the Lord and God. So just to reiterate something that we've already come across several times in Exodus, God makes the explicit connection between this word Yahweh, which on the one hand might seem like a national, local deity, and the God that is known and referred to in the wider ancient Near East, often referred to as El or Elohim. So the text says, God said to Moses, you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh, the Lord, the God, Elohim of your fathers, the God, Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, the Elohim of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, meaning Yahweh is, and my memorial name to all generations. So Yahweh is Elohim, God. That's the Elohim known throughout the region by many peoples. And Elohim is Yahweh. Elohim is the God of Moses' ancestors. Yahweh is the God of Moses' ancestors. Yahweh is the God of all the peoples of the ancient Near East, and Elohim is the God of all the peoples of the ancient Near East. But now this Yahweh Elohim being is telling Moses something else. This is the name that by which Elohim wants to be remembered. The memorial name is what is said here. Memorial name is referring to the name that one uses when they remember a person, call them to mind, and in this case, specifically relative to the divine, it's the name that one would use when calling on God, thinking of God, worshiping God, offering a sacrifice to God, praying to God, etc. That's different than just saying, "Oh God," generic being. We don't talk to each other that way, do we? We don't say, oh, human, oh, other person that I'm talking to. We use names. It's more personal, it's direct, it's intimate. And that's part of the importance, I think, of saying that this is God's memorial name, the name to use. Now, this is a place to mention something very important, I think. I've been discussing all this openly and freely, though for my devout Jewish listeners, this would not be appreciated most likely, or at least certainly not how they would be talking about the divine name. For them, there would be a much less direct approach, utilizing circumlocutions, ways of talking around this name. Talking about God, okay, but not using the name. Not using that name specifically, not referring to it specifically. Okay, now after all this talk about the name, in response to Moses' second question, who are you? The text records that God reiterates a lot of what we've already observed. So I'll just summarize it here. God goes on to say again that God's intention is to come down and deliver and to take the people of Israel and off to the land of 6 other nations. The main addition here, though, is as Exodus 3 is coming to a close, is that God tells Moses that the elders of the people of Israel will listen to him and that Pharaoh will not. And that's going to set up a whole dynamic in the coming chapters. But that leads to the third question. This affirmation that the elders of Israel are going to believe him leads to the next interaction, which is basically, yeah, but what if they don't believe me? Now, my dad sometimes called me a yabbit bird because of how often I would say, yeah, but, in response to something he was telling me. And Moses has a yeah, but here as well. And he expresses it right at the start of Exodus chapter 4. Moses said, yeah, but what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? They might say the Lord hasn't appeared to you. God has just told him they're going to believe you. Yeah, but what if they don't? Well, one of the things I really appreciate here is I really resonate with this. I'm not claiming that I've had encounters like this, of course, but I have at times in my life sensed some sort of a deep conviction that this or that was something I was supposed to do, quote unquote, or to say or to take part in. And yet I've always felt my own internal, yeah, but, the questions and the uncertainties. What if it doesn't work out that way? And Moses does as well, and he voices them directly. It's a feature in the way his relationship with the divine is presented by our author that I really love. It's open, raw, honest, questioning, and it's one of the reasons that I call Moses a friend. God's response to this is, in effect, all right, I'm going to give you some tools of persuasion, by which I mean miracles, and 3 miracles specifically. And basically, here's what they are. Moses' walking stick is going to turn into a snake and then back into a stick again. Moses' own hand is going to turn leprous and then be restored. And Moses is going to be able to turn some water into blood. Now, I don't really want to go into the details of the miracles or even the question of whether miracles do or even can happen or not. That's a topic that interests me. I have thoughts about all of that related to my ways of integrating things like quantum physics and the spiritual realities of the cosmos and the way I see the divine. But what I'm focused on here is the dialogue between Moses and God and what it tells us about these 2 characters in the narrative. So I'm going to leave those curiosities on the side for now. Moses, again, is open and direct and questioning and honest. But what does God's response to Moses' yeah, but say about how the text presents the nature or character of God? First, remember, God said the elders will believe you? Well, if God was so sure that the elders were going to listen, why now offer to provide proof? It shouldn't be needed, right? And not just 1 proof, but 3. And why does the narrative pepper it with God saying things like, well, if they don't believe the first sign, then do this. And if they don't believe the second sign, then why the ifs if God knows they're going to listen? It sounds as if God's not quite as certain of the response of the Israelite leaders as we were led to believe. But doesn't God know everything ahead of time? Apparently not, according to the text, or at least not always, or not in the way we might normally take the meaning of that assertion. This is a real interaction between Moses and God, a real back and forth with real questions and real consequences at stake. And I think it's part of the co-agency that we have noted, according to the books of Moses. God is going to bring them up, Moses will bring them up. God has come down to save, Moses will go and save. Moses isn't sure the people will believe, and evidently, God is now becoming not so sure either. In a sense, they're both in the same spot. All right, well, let's do this and see what happens. But they're in it together. I know this has a lot of implications for how my Christian listeners will appreciate or not appreciate my take on all this, but I'm taking it from what is being said in the text. And this whole way of portraying the divine human interaction and interrelationship is a big reason why the books of Moses are my friend, in spite of so much that I think they actually get wrong about God. So Moses gets 3 signs, but this doesn't actually satisfy my friend Moses. His next response really isn't a question, it's a statement. Verse 10. So in response to the 3 miracles that God tells him to do, Moses says, yeah, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you've spoken to your servant, for I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. Not even since you've spoken to me. In other words, in the last 10 minutes. You may have noticed, God, that as I'm talking to you, I don't do a great job. I just find that that's interesting, an interesting addition in the text. In other words, what Moses is saying here is, okay, it's great that I'm going to have these signs to show them. It's great that you promised to be with me, but you're asking me to take on a role that will require me to speak in front of people, in front of powerful people, in front of the leaders of Israel and Egypt. It will require me to speak in front of people a lot. There will be a lot of talking. And, well, I'm just not good at that. Now, there's a few things to note. It's possible Moses is speaking of an actual speech impediment, of course. It's also possible he means something more like, look, I'm not a very good public speaker. I don't have the skills. It's also possible, in other words, the first one, it could be physical, a physical impediment. The second one is it may just be a skill thing. But there's a third possibility, and that is that this is just personal speculation on my part, it's possible that Moses' childhood experiences before his mother put him in that basket on the river have left scars, psychological reasons for his difficulty speaking and his sense of being inadequate. He was likely raised in his earliest days and weeks and months to be shushed, kept silent. After all, making noise, crying, baby talk, speaking as he learned to talk was a dangerous business, and probably would have been quickly shut down by his parents, I can imagine. Whatever the details about Moses' insecurities, Exodus is telling us that Moses feels inadequate for the task. That's the main point, all speculation aside. And this goes back to his first question, who am I to do this? He's still there. He asks, who am I? He asks, who are you? He asks, what if they don't believe me? He's still, look, I just don't have what it takes. He's still really stuck on that first thing. And the reassurances so far offered have not erased any of that deeper sense of not being up to the task, not being fit for it, not being the right person. And God's response to Moses here is very similar to God's response to the first question. Remember, who am I to do this? I'll be with you. Here, verse 11 tells us, the Lord said to him, well, who made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Isn't it me? Go, even I, will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you're to say. Now, there's material here that really troubles me. God making deaf, mute, blind. It's just glossed over and passed by because for the author, and I'm going to assume for Moses, it's just a given. It's the way things are. And I think that warrants a whole other conversation. Why do things like that happen to people? Does God do such things, or does God allow such things? These are questions similar to some of the earlier questions I've raised in other episodes about why Israel is in bondage to begin with, for example, and why that's gone on for so long, and why way back in the first part of Genesis, God created a crafty creature like the snake, and why that thing was allowed into Eden. Now, I'm in the God allows this but doesn't do it camp, but that actually just doesn't fully answer all the troubling questions. I'm just going to note it here because I've gone into it before, and there's a lot more to deal with than we have space for right now. I'm going to reiterate that the texts of the books of Moses just don't answer that question. Maybe John and the Buddha can help us later when I get them into the same room with Moses. So back to the text, the focus of which here is on Moses' insecurity and the reassurance offered by co-agency. There's a different version of it here, but it's very similar to that very first bit of reassurance we saw when God said, I'll be with you. Here he says, I'll be with your mouth. And I, even I, will be with your mouth is an extra emphatic way of saying it. I, me, this me here, the one who is, I'm going to be with your mouth. I'll teach you what to say and how to speak. So get over it. Again, he's not reassuring Moses about anything that has to do with Moses. The reassurance is co-agency between the divine and Moses at the precise point of Moses' insecurity. This is where I will be with you. That's where the text tells us God promises to meet Moses and work with him, right at the heart of his insecurity and inadequacy, which is something I sit with and meditate on frequently as well. I have at times in my own way experienced a sense that precisely in my most vulnerable, scared, insecure moments, when I feel most inadequate, there is some kind of presence, even an energy sometimes. And I wonder if that's the kind of reality the text is trying to get at here. All right, so case closed, right? Moses now has every reassurance he's going to need. God is going to be his collaborator at every step, going to teach him what to say. Let's go, right? Not quite. Moses has another response, and I think it really finally gets down to the nitty-gritty, the real reason behind his objections. And I'm not saying that he doesn't actually feel inadequate. I think he does. But this is really getting to the bottom line, and no amount of reassurance is actually probably going to solve this one. Here's verse 13. Moses said, "Please, Lord, just send the message by whomever you will." This is the point where Moses says something like, actually, you know what, if I'm being honest, it isn't about any of the things I've been asking. It's not about who I am or who are you or proving you've spoken to me or helping me overcome my inadequacies. Honestly, I just don't want to do this. And I'm fascinated by how the author reports what Moses said. The specific wording, send the message by whomever you will. And maybe Moses just means to simply say, send someone else, but it's somehow ironic to me that he phrases it that way. Send whomever you want, says Moses, to which if I were God, I might want to say, well, that's what I've been doing. You're the whomever that I want. Instead, God's response in the text is yet another reason that I see the relationship of divine and human in the books of Moses in a raw, real, authentic presentation of that. Because the text says, first, God gets angry. Verse 14, the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. It's like, okay, look, man, I've put up with this long enough. I've tried to meet you here. I've tried to hear you. I've tried to respond. I have adjusted. But look, this is too much. Just get on with it. Except that isn't what God says. He doesn't say, just get on with it. In spite of being frustrated, God actually adjusts to Moses yet again. Verse 14 continues, look, isn't your brother Aaron, the Levite, coming? I know he speaks fluently, and he's already on his way here to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. The adjustment God is making is basically, all right, look, I'm not exactly agreeing to send somebody else, somebody other than you, Moses, but look, I hear you, okay? So I'm going to bring in some help. God adjusts again. But there's something else I notice here. Aaron was already on the way. In other words, he began coming to meet Moses before all this. I mean, he was hundreds of miles away. So wait, did God have this planned all along? If so, why not just tell Moses this from the beginning? Maybe there was a plan A. Moses says yes, and then a plan B. All right, well, I'll add Aaron in. And who knows, maybe there's a plan C somewhere in there. Maybe there actually is somebody else that God would have sent if Moses just finally said a flat no. I'm told that Bob Dylan was once asked, his name was actually Robert Zimmerman. He was once asked, why the name and all that kind of thing, and the name change and the persona and everything. And he basically said, look, somebody had to be Bob Dylan. If it wasn't me, it was going to be somebody else. And I wonder if there was a plan C where somebody's got to be Moses. And if it's not Moses, somebody's going to do it. Maybe. But here's what I'm thinking when I see that Aaron was already on the way. And it's maybe that plan A, B, C, and maybe there's a D, I don't know, are somehow all operating at the same time, like plan B is already in play. What if all the contingency planning is already set in place? Maybe the idea that God has a plan isn't wrong so much as it's just way too simplistic. If co-agency is real, then there must be a million scenarios in even the simplest decisions in which humans and the divine are co-agenting. Well, verses 15 and 16 pick up a little bit further. Moses, you're going to speak to Aaron, and you'll put the words in his mouth, and I, even I, again there's that emphatic I, I'll be with your mouth, he's re-emphasizing that, and I will teach you what you're to do, repeating himself. And moreover, then he will speak for you to the people. So we're going to take that load off of you. And he'll be like a mouth for you, and you will be like God to him. So Moses isn't off the hook. On the one hand, there is an adjustment. Aaron is going to be brought in. He's going to be the public face. But at the same time, the core idea hasn't changed. God simply restates what he's already said. I'm going to be with your mouth. You're going to do this, Moses. And that reality gets emphasized in what the text tells us God says next in verse 17. You will take in your hand this staff, and you will perform the signs. We've already been over that, right? In other words, come on, get going. And by the way, don't forget that stick. Now, once again, it's Moses' turn to respond. Any more questions? Anything more he wants to say? Verse 18, Moses departed, returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said, please let me go, that I might return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see if they're still alive. And Jethro says to Moses, go in peace. I think the text reads as if at the end of the day, Moses just simply sort of gives up. Without saying anything, it seems like he just turns around and leaves. Kind of a quiet resignation in the way that the story is unfolding here. What was he feeling? What was he thinking? I don't know. He doesn't say anything. He just turns around and, I guess we could say, gets on with it. What we do know is that he begins. And as he makes his way back to his father-in-law and his family in Midian, we will begin a whole new chapter in the story. A chapter that we will continue next time.